talk about how to shift. It could be a little shift, it could be a big shift. It could be how to get started in creating governance. The first thing, prepare. So I talked about this authorship paradox before. Who gets to decide who decides? This is challenging when you're getting started or when you're doing something like building a new board for the first time. You get stuck in this loop of our structure is that the board votes in new board members, but we don't have any board members yet. So what do we do? I just talked about this process of draft, feedback, draft, approval, which has worked really well for us. So often when the staff has to make a decision because that body isn't in place yet, or because it hasn't been clear who makes the decision, we'll say, here's our first tab. What do you think? And then people will give feedback and we'll say, okay, here's our second draft. What do you think? And people will give feedback. And then we'll say, okay, we think we heard everyone. Here's our proposal. Speak now or forever hold your peace. We'll draft it again if we need to. We'll discuss it again if we need to, but we think we heard you. How does this look? And that's worked really well for getting buy-in from the really large group where some people don't even check their email. Some people have big opinions and they show up to every meeting. So at some point, someone just has to do the admin leadership. And at the beginning, that admin leadership is so important, right? Just getting someone to write it down and say, is this right? I put it in writing. Do you agree with my understanding of what's happening? And then specificity is really the soul of good governance planning. The more you can think concretely and consciously and slowly and completely about your decision-making processes, the less you'll have to catch yourself and be like, oh, we did it wrong. And you will do it wrong. So some of it is just, you got to try it and see how it goes. But it's really worth spending time daylighting all the decisions and work that's involved in your organization, and then thinking about who does them and what their role is. Here's a little insight into what we've done. It's a little in the weeds, but this is how we've done it. So we have two separate documents that are actually in progress right now. We're still working on them. But you'll see on the left, these sort of like definitions of how people are involved in something, right? So authority to decide. This is the group that ultimately makes the decision. Responsible for accomplishing. Like, this is what this person or this body is responsible for getting done. They hold the bottom line for this, getting over that finish line, being completed, being done well. Key contributors are people who could check in and out of a project. They could be consulted, they could help a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's not their fault if it doesn't get done. And then who are they evaluated by? Who is determining success? And this was something we left vague for a long time. And it turns out many of us have different definitions of success, and that has caused some friction. So getting clear about who gets to decide what success looks like and whether you've achieved it is really important, even though it's a little awkward. Our staff, as I mentioned, as a body, right? So like us together, we allocate staff benefits, we decide on our working policies and schedule, and we decide on internal collaboration systems. We figure out how, when we're going to work and the way that we are compensated for it based on our total compensation allowance. We're responsible for executing the strategic plan. Ultimately, that's our bottom line that we hold, and ensuring operational success defined by the board, and cultivating diverse and inclusive leadership is part of that. And then you'll see each staff director and any potential staff manager has very specific roles as well. And so that staff director, while they might hold the bottom line and be responsible for accomplishing the strategic plan, they have authority to decide how to best meet those strategic objectives within their area, and then how they spend the money that accomplishes that. You'll see I have the program volunteer box highlighted. That's just where my cursor was, but this is autonomy, right? So the authority to decide for them is really what they have autonomy over. So they get to decide how much they are involved in the organization. They get to pick their own schedule, and they get to figure out the best ways to solve the problems when they're there. They have autonomy to do their job. They're responsible just for accomplishing very discrete tasks, right? So volunteers need to make sure tools get checked in and out, cleaned, members have a good experience, people pay for their membership, that stuff. They're a contributor to determining policies and practices, but those policies and practices are under the authority of the staff director. So that is a line that has been really important for us to clarify, right? That program volunteers, like Vivek said, when folks were in breakout rooms, they know best how things should get implemented. But sometimes there are things that a staff director has to decide. That would be the best way to implement it, but we don't have the money. Or that would be the best way to implement it, but I know that we're not going to have enough volunteers to do that, something like that. Okay. I also want to introduce, if you haven't seen it before, the idea of a RACI chart. This acronym could be anything. We use RACI internally: responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. This is the same idea as this chart, but it's instead of talking about each individual person, we're starting with the task. So this is just a different way to slice and dice the same thing. So what we have been working on is a massive list of everything that happens here at the library. Literally everything that gets done, every decision, kind of decision that gets made, everything from who takes out the trash to who decides how big our expense budget should be, everything. And then we're going through and determining who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. So responsible is who is implementing this. So this is the administrative leadership. Accountable is the sort of like authorities. I guess it's like it's a different framework, but accountable means like at the end of the day, whose job is it to make sure that this got done? Who is consulted? Whose knowledge do we need in order to do this thing or make this decision? And then who's informed about the work that we've done? So I picked a couple different examples. So selecting new tools for the library. The people who really do it are the library committee. But at the end of the day, the staff person in charge of the library is the one that buys them, right? They decide, yes, we're going to spend the money. No, we're not going to spend the money. We find out how to do this by asking our active members, right? Like, what tools do you want to borrow? And then we tell the greater community when we have acquired new tools, we're like, hey, we have new tools. Maybe you should join the library, right? So that's a workflow and the roles for that task. Changing COVID policy is something that is more internal, right? So the staff leadership team changes the policy, but the co-directors, the senior staff are the ones who decide what the policy should be. And then the staff really implement it. We update the website. We tell people about it. We are the ones out there being like, hey, we don't require masks anymore. Let's talk about it. The board in this case was just consulted. We decided this was a staff decision to make, but the board had to be like on board with it. So sometimes we talk about another column, which is like who needs to be in consensus about this decision, not just consulted. And then we informed our active members, hey, we've changed our COVID policies. There might be times when the same person or group holds multiple roles. So scheduling volunteer meetings, the volunteer manager has to make sure that gets done, and they also get to pick when the meetings happen. But the volunteers need to be both consulted about when they should happen. So like, hopefully we can get the most number of volunteers there because it's the best schedule for everyone. And then we tell them the volunteers need to be informed about when the meetings happen. So there's no perfect chart. There's no perfect model or graphic organizer for work planning and role planning, role clarity. But these are two that have worked pretty well for us. So you can either talk about what each person or each group gets to do, or you can go task by task and say, what is everyone's role in this thing that we're doing, in this decision that we're making? I know I've said a couple of these already, but in addressing governance in a way that is community-centered, equitable, inclusive, all of the things that I think are inherent to libraries of things, right? We don't do anything the way that everything is done, right? Like we are inherently disruptive, we are inherently radical, because what we are doing is envisioning a different world where we share resources. And so how do we share power as a resource is just a huge question for us. Governance is really important to everything that we're doing. So you have to be patient, you have to listen to feedback. Ego and good governance do not go well together. So if you are vetting new board members or new staff members, keep an eye out for somebody who cares more about their opinion, about the good of the organization, and really screen for people who know how to give and take feedback, because consensus, especially co-directorship, shared leadership, you have to be able to be honest with each other and then be willing to try something imperfect and adjust it as you go. We've been iterating on this for 11 years and we have such a long way to go, but we wouldn't be where we are if we hadn't tried at some point.